You don't get to your 60s without knowing when someone crosses a line. And on that night, a line was crossed. A serious discussion turned into comments about appearance. The tone changed. The air got heavy. And once again, it felt like power, trying to shrink someone down. But Alexandria didn't shrink. She didn't match insult with insult. She did something much harder. She raised the standard. What followed wasn't loud. It wasn't chaotic. That it was controlled. And that's what made it powerful? If you believe leadership should show strength without cruelty, what happened next will remind you exactly why that matters. Asterisk. The lights in the studio were warm and soft. Everything was designed to feel steady, safe, serious. Behind this stage, a large screen displayed the title of the evening's event, The Future of Working Families. The topic sounded important, practical, real. People in the audience had come expecting answers about wages, healthcare, and rising costs. Some leaned forward in their seats. Others held notepads. Everyone seemed ready for a thoughtful discussion. On the giant screen appeared President Donald Trump speaking love from his residence. He looked comfortable, relaxed in his chair, slight smile, confident posture. Across from the screen sat Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez was in the studio, seated beside host Lena Hart. Alexandria's back was straight. Her hands rested calmly in front of her. Her face showed focus, not emotion. At first, everything moved as expected. The president spoke about economic strength, about progress, about how families were doing better. His voice carried assurance. Supporters in the room nodded along. For a moment, it seemed like a typical political discussion. Then came a small pause. It was barely noticeable. Trump leaned slightly toward the camera. You know, he said, smiling. Alexandria is very passionate. That sounded normal enough. But then he added, she's actually very cute when she's angry. A few awkward laughs echoed through the audience. Not loud, not confident, uncertain. The camera cut briefly to Alexandria. She did not smile. She did not frown. She simply looked back at the screen. Still, Trump continued speaking. She's got a great look, he added. Very marketable. The word marketable seemed to float in the air longer than it should have. And honestly, he went on, if she worked for me, I'd probably put her on RA, not in the boardroom. This time, there was no laughter. A few quiet murmurs spread through the room. Someone shifted in their seat. Got another person whispered something under their breath. The topic of the night had quietly changed. Do that. It was no longer about working families. It was about her appearance. Alexandria's jaw tightened slightly. That was the only visible reaction. She did not interrupt. She did not defend herself. She waited. Trump leaned back in his chair, clearly pleased with the moment. Then he shifted again. Let's talk about family values, he said. His tone became proud. Nobody believes in family more than I do. He began speaking about his children, about how successful they were, about how proud he was. Then he brought up his daughter, Ivanka. She's perfect, he said. Gorgeous, a 10 in every way. He repeated the praise. Her beauty, her presence. Each word about appearance came easily. Naturally. The audience grew quieter because the pattern was becoming clear. First, Alexandria's looks, his daughter's looks. The discussion about wages and healthcare seemed far away. Lena glanced toward Alexandria for a brief second. It was a quick look, the kind that asks, are you going to respond? Alexandria remained calm, but her eyes sharpened. The energy in the studio had shifted from relaxed to tense. And what made it even more uncomfortable was how casual it felt. There was no shouting, no obvious anger, just words that slowly changed the direction of the night. Trump continued, smiling. She's always been beautiful, he added. The repetition made people shift again in their seats, because this wasn't just pride. It sounded like rating, and the audience could feel the difference. The air in the room felt heavier now. The original topic, working families, sat quietly in the background like a forgotten promise. What had started as a policy conversation, that turned personal, and the contrast between the two speakers was becoming impossible to ignore. On the screen, confidence mixed with mockery. In the studio, calm control. Alexandria still had not spoken. And that silence was growing more powerful with every second. Sometimes silence makes people nervous. It makes them wonder what is coming next. The camera slowly zoomed in on her face. Steady eyes, measured breathing. She wasn't reacting emotionally. She was preparing. The audience sensed it. Because when someone holds their response, instead of firing back instantly, it usually means one thing. They're choosing their moment carefully. Trump finished his comments with a small shrug, as if the remarks were harmless. But the room no longer felt harmless. The conversation had crossed an invisible line, a kind of line that doesn't make noise when it's crossed, but everyone feels it. Lena straightened in her chair, preparing to shift the conversation back. But before she could speak, one thought was clear in every mind in that studio. This was no longer just a debate. It was about how power speaks, and Alexandria had been listening to every word. The real conversation had not even started yet, and when it did, it was going to change the entire room. Asterisk. The studio felt different now. Not louder, not chaotic, just heavier. The air carried something unspoken. Lena adjusted her papers. She cleared her throat softly. It was her quiet signal that the floor was about to shift. Congresswoman, she said carefully, would you like to respond? All eyes turned to Alexandria. For a second, she didn't move. Then she inhaled slowly. Not dramatically, not angrily, just steady. And when she finally spoke, her voice surprised everyone. It wasn't sharp. It wasn't loud. It was calm. Thank you, she began. That simple phrase settled the room. She turned slightly toward the large screen where the president was still visible. I think tonight was supposed to be about working families, she said. About people who wake up early, work long hours, and still struggle to pay their bills. Her tone stayed measured, but instead, she continued gently. We spent several minutes talking about how women look. No accusation, no raised voice, just a clear statement. The audience shifted again, this time in agreement. Trump leaned forward slightly on the screen, as if preparing to interrupt, but she continued before he could. And I want to say something important, she said. When women step into public life, especially into leadership, we are often judged first by appearance, not by ideas. The words were simple, but they landed hard. She wasn't speaking only for herself. Now she was pointing to something bigger, something many people in that room had seen before. She paused, not because she was unsure, but because she wanted the words to breathe. In boardrooms, she said calmly, women are called emotional. In politics, they're called traumatic. And when they stay quiet, they're called weak. She looked directly at the camera. So, tonight, I'd like to stay focused on policy. The audience grew very still. Trump shifted in his chair. She wasn't attacking him. She wasn't insulting him. She was redirecting the conversation and doing it without anger. And that made it stronger. I respect pride in one's family, she continued. We all love our children. We all think they're wonderful. There was a brief softness in her tone there. But reducing women to numbers or appearance, she added, doesn't help working families afford health care. A few quiet claps began in the back of the room. Not loud, but real. Trump smiled tightly. You're taking it too seriously, he said quickly. It was a compliment. There it was, the word many people expected. Compliment. Alexandria nodded slightly. I understand that's how it may have been intended, she replied, still calm, still steady. But here's the thing, she continued. Intent and impact are not always the same. That sentence hung in the air because it was not aggressive. It was educational. She wasn't scolding. She was explaining. When young girls watch conversations like this, she said, they learn what matters. Do they learn that their ideas matter or that their appearance matters? The room felt even quieter now. Even the small movements, someone adjusting glasses, someone crossing their legs, seemed louder than before. Trump crossed his arms. I've hired many successful women, he said defensively. Very successful, and that's good. Alexandria responded quickly. That's important. Again, no attack. Agreement, where possible. But leadership, she added, is also about example. Her voice remained steady. Tonight is an example. There it was. The shift. This was no longer about a personal remark. It was about standards, not about tone. About how power chooses to speak. She leaned slightly forward. If we want stronger families, she said, we need stronger conversations. And stronger conversations focus on solutions. The audience began clapping again, this time louder, not explosive, but steady. Trump's smile faded slightly. He tried to regain control. Well, he said with a shrug, people know I speak freely. And that's your style, she answered. Then she added something that changed the mood completely. But freedom of speech doesn't remove responsibility. The words were soft, but sharp. The room reacted with a mix of silence and applause. Because that statement didn't attack. It challenged. Trump opened his mouth to respond, but for the first time that evening, he hesitated. It was small, but visible. Alexandria had not raised her voice. She had not insulted. She had not mocked. Instead, she reframed the entire conversation from personality to principle, from appearance to accountability. And in doing that, she shifted the power dynamic without anyone noticing the exact moment it happened. Lena leaned in, sensing the change. "Let's return to healthcare costs," she said quickly, but something had already happened. The room was no longer reacting to personality. It was thinking, and thinking changes everything on the screen. Trump adjusted his tie, in the studio. Alexandria folded her hands again. Calm, controlled, prepared, because the conversation about policy was about to begin, and now, everyone was listening differently. The applause slowly faded, but the tension did not. It stayed in the room like a quiet storm waiting to move. Lena tried to guide the conversation back to healthcare costs. She mentioned rising premiums, prescription prices, families choosing between rent and medicine. For a moment, it seemed like the debate had returned to safe ground. Trump began listing achievements, numbers, claims of progress. Confidence returned to his voice. But something was different now. Every sentence felt heavier because the room was no longer listening. The same way, people were not just hearing policy, they were watching character. Alexandria listened without interrupting. She took notes. Occasionally she nodded, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement. Then Trump shifted again. "You talk a lot about responsibility," he said, looking straight into the camera. "But responsibility also means understanding how the real world works." The tone was sharper now, less playful, more direct. "In the real world," he continued, "strength matters. Toughness matters, and not everyone is built for that." The words were not loud, but they carried a challenge. The audience sensed it immediately. This was no longer about policy details. This was about credibility, about who belongs in power. Alexandria raised her eyes from her notes. She didn't react quickly. She'll let him finish. "And frankly," Trump added, "some people focus too much on feelings instead of results." There it was again, the suggestion that calm equals weakness. That empathy equals softness. Thought that leadership must look a certain way. A quiet murmur moved through the crowd because many people recognized that tone. It's the tone that says strength is only one shape. Lena glanced at Alexandria again. This time the look was different. It wasn't just, "Are you going to respond?" It was, "How will you respond?" Alexandria placed her pen down slowly, carefully, and she leaned forward just slightly. "I agree," she began. The audience blinked. "Do agree?" "I agree that strength matters." Her voice remained steady, "but we may define it differently." The room grew still again. She continued, "Strength is not about who talks the loudest. It's not about who interrupts, and it's not about who reduces others to labels." Her tone did not rise, but each sentence built pressure. "To me," she said, "strength is staying focused when the conversation tries to distract you." There was a small pause. "Strength is protecting people who don't have power, and strength is knowing that dignity is not weakness." The audience responded with a soft wave of applause. Not explosive, but meaningful. Trump smiled again, but it was tighter now. "You're very polished," he said, "very rehearsed." It was meant to undercut her, to suggest performance instead of sincerity, but she didn't flinch. "Preparation is respect," she replied calmly. That line caused a few heads in the audience to nod. "If I'm discussing healthcare," she continued, "families deserve that. I come prepared. No drama. Just logic." Trump shifted in his seat again. Then he leaned closer to the camera. "Well," he said, "people also deserve leaders who aren't afraid to speak plainly." The challenge was clear. He was painting himself as bold and her as cautious. Alexandria folded her hands. "Plain speech is valuable," she agreed. "But plain speech should still build something." That sentence landed quietly. "Otherwise," she added, "it becomes noise." The audience reacted instantly this time. The applause broke out stronger than before. Not overwhelming, but confident. And something changed in that moment because the conversation was no longer about who could dominate the room. It was about who could guide it. Trump tried to pivot again. He returned to economic growth. He cited progress, but the energy had shifted. Every time he spoke now, the audience measured the tone, measured the intent, measured the example. Alexandria did not interrupt once. She waited, and when she responded, she stayed with policy, healthcare access, childcare costs, paid leave. Each answer was simple, clear, focus, and that contrast became impossible to ignore. One style pushed, the other grounded. One tried to control, the other redirected. The studio lights felt brighter now, the tension sharper because everyone could feel it. This debate was no longer about winning a point. It was about defining leadership in real time. Trump leaned back, crossing his arms again. "You know," he said slowly, People like confidence. It wasn't a question. It was a claim. Alexandria looked straight ahead. Yes, she said softly. They do. A small pause. But they also like respect. Silence. Complete silence. Complete silence. Even the air conditioning hum seemed louder. The camera slowly tightened on both faces. One in the screen, one in the studio. Two very different approaches. Two very different definitions of power. And for the first time that evening, it wasn't clear who held it. Because sometimes the loudest voice fills the room, but the calmest voice changes it, and something was spilled ink. The next exchange would decide everything. By now, the room was no longer divided by opinion, but it was divided by feeling. Every word carried weight. Every pause carried meaning. Trump leaned forward again. His voice was steady but sharper than before. You talk about respect, he said, but respect is earned. The sentence was simple, but the tone carried a test. It was no longer about healthcare. It was no longer about families. It was about legitimacy. About who deserves to stand in that space. The audience felt it instantly. Alexandria didn't answer right away. She let the words settle, then she nodded slowly. I agree, she said. Respect is earned. The room grew still, but respect is also shown, she added. Not louder. Just. Clearer. You don't wait for someone to earn basic dignity. A soft wave moved through the crowd. Some people leaned forward. Others folded their arms, thinking. Trump tilted his head slightly. That's politics, he replied. It's tough. Not everyone can handle it. There it was again. The suggestion that strength has only one form. That toughness equals leadership. Alexandria took a breath. When people say politics is tough, she began calmly, what they often mean is that it allows behavior we wouldn't accept anywhere else. The sentence hung in the air because it was true in a simple way. If a manager spoke about an employee's appearance in a workplace, she continued, we would question that. If a teacher spoke that way about a student, we would question that. So, why? She asked softly. Should leadership be different? Silence. Complete silence. Even Trump paused, because this was no longer about him. It was about standards. About example. About what people normalize. He shifted in his chair again. Well, he said, people know I speak my mind, and that honesty is important. Alexandria nodded. Again, yes, she agreed. Honesty is powerful. She paused. But honesty without care can still cause harm. That line did something to the room. It slowed everything down, because now the discussion wasn't about winning. It was about consequences. Trump's expression tightened slightly. You're making this bigger than it is, he said. Maybe he believed that, maybe he didn't. But Alexandria did not argue. She simply responded, when young leaders watch this, she said, they're learning how power behaves. And when power comfort over care, it sends a message. She didn't raise her voice, but the weight of that statement filled the studio. The audience began clapping again, this time, stronger. Longer. Not because of anger, but because something had been named clearly. Trump let the applause finish. Then he leaned closer to the camera once more. You're very good at this, he said slowly. The compliment didn't sound warm. It sounded measured. Calculated. Alexandria smiled slightly. Thank you, she said. No. Sarcasm. No. Edge. Just composure. And that composure made the contrast sharper than ever because by now everyone could see it. This was not a shouting match. It was a test of control. Trump tried one final time. You talk about dignity, he said, but leadership is about results. The word results landed firmly, as if it ended the debate. Alexandria didn't interrupt. She didn't rush. Instead, she asked a question. What kind of results? Those at 4 words, but they changed everything. What kind of results? She repeated gently. Higher numbers or higher standards? The audience reacted before Trump could answer. A wave of sound. Not chaotic but powerful, because the question forced the choice numbers or values. Speed or example. Power or responsibility. Trump opened his mouth to respond, but for a brief second, there were no words. And in that second, something shifted, because leadership is not only about speaking. Sometimes it's about what happens when the speaking stops. The room held its breath, and everyone knew. The next response would define the night. The room was silent. Not uncomfortable. Not chaotic. Just waiting. Trump finally spoke. Results are what matter, he said. Growth. Strength. Winning. His voice had steadied again. Confident. Firm. But something had changed. The words sounded practice. Predictable. Because the question still hung in the air. What kind of results? Alexandria didn't rush to respond. She looked down for a brief moment, then back up. And when she spoke, her voice was softer than before. But stronger. Results matter, she agreed. When families can afford medicine, that's a result. When parents don't have to choose between rent and food, that's a result. When young women grow up believing their ideas matter more than their appearance, that's a result. The audience didn't clap right away. They listened, because this wasn't a comeback. Thought it was a reframing, she continued. But how we achieve results also matters. She leaned slightly forward. If we teach that leadership means dominance, we get fear. If we teach that leadership means mockery, we get division. But if we teach that leadership means accountability, she paused, we get trust. That word settled deeply. Trust that you could almost feel people thinking about it. Trust at work. Trust at home. Trust in leadership. Trump remained still on the screen. For once, he didn't interrupt. He didn't push back immediately, because this was no longer about quick responses. It was about tone, about example. Alexandria's voice stayed calm. I don't believe strength and respect are opposites, she said. I believe they belong together. She folded her hands gently. You can be firm without being cruel. You can be confident without being dismissive. You can be powerful without being careless. Each sentence built slowly, clearly. Easy to understand, and that simplicity made it powerful. The audience began to clap again. Not explosive, not wild, but steady like agreement. Trump, finally, leaned forward. Well, he said, people will decide what kind of leadership they want. There was no sharp edge now, just a statement. Alexandria nodded. They will, she replied. And that's the beauty of responsibility. No attack, no sarcasm, just closure. Lena stepped in, sensing the natural ending. Tonight, she said carefully, we've heard different views on strength, leadership, and accountability. She thanked both speakers. But even as she wrapped up, it was clear the debate had moved beyond policy. It had become a lesson not about who won, but about how power behaves. As the studio lights dimmed slightly, the audience remained thoughtful because something simple had been shown. Power can speak loudly. Or it can speak carefully. Power can reduce, or it can elevate. Power can demand respect, or it can model it. And in that room, under those bright lights, two styles stood side by side. One relied on force of personality. Other relied on steadiness. One tested limits. The other defined them. The discussion about healthcare and wages would continue. Another day, policies would change. Numbers would rise and fall. But what people would remember most was Natada. Statistic. It was a tone. It was the moment when silence became strength. The moment when calm redirected chaos. The moment when a simple question, what kind of results, shifted the entire conversation, because leadership is not just about winning an exchange. It's about what remains after the exchange is over. And as the cameras faded and the room slowly emptied, one truth lingered quietly in the air. Real power doesn't need to prove itself loudly. It proves itself by example. And that example speaks long after the words are gone.